Hello, my name is Bob Plaschke, and for most of my adult life or working life, I've had the extreme privilege to spend time with and serve emergency responders. First Response, the name of this podcast, is an effort to get behind the badge that these people wear and understand the highs and lows that these emergency responders face and how they handle them. This podcast is graciously sponsored by PepperBall, where I have the honor to serve as the CEO. PepperBall, for those that haven't heard of the company, we make a non-lethal alternative to guns that police use to keep themselves and the public they serve safe. So today my guest is Sheriff Scott Rose. Sheriff Scott Rose, based in the great state of Minnesota. A really interesting background, as we'll hear about. Wasn't a sheriff for the entirety of his life. Has done a number of other interesting things, but most importantly, I think to me, he hosts a podcast called the Officer Down Memorial Podcast, where he talks to folks who have been involved in events that have been pretty scary, and where in some cases people have been killed in action and under the pursuit of the service, and talks about the effects of that. And I found that both compelling and inspirational, despite some of the sadness that comes from those events. So Sheriff Rose, thank you. Tell me, thanks for joining us on the podcast. Tell me, what was the inspiration for you to start the Officer Down Memorial Podcast?
Thanks for having me, Bob. I appreciate it. With the podcast, I lost a dear friend of mine, one of my best friends at work, line of duty back in 2013. And I ended up getting involved with the Minnesota Law Enforcement Memorial Association then when he died, because we didn't know what to do. We'd never had a line of duty death. We'd never dealt with that kind of a complex event within our small organization. And I reached out to Lima. They were amazing, and I felt that was an organization I wanted to be a part of. I wanted to help other families, other agencies who were struggling with the loss of one of their own. And I ended up getting on the board, being elected to their board. I'm on the board of directors for Lima, Minnesota's Law Enforcement Memorial Association. I'm on the board of directors for Invisible Wounds Project in Minnesota. And I'm also on the board of directors for the Law Enforcement Memorial Foundation of Southeast Minnesota, all really stemming from the loss of my dear friend and our dear friend, Lauren Gunther, from our office at the Dodge County Sheriff's Office. And that kind of kicked off my interest in working with survivor families. And it progressed from there into recognizing that with these fallen officers, there's so much more to their stories that never gets told outside of 2 or 3 sentences in a small paragraph you see on their memorial page, either with the state or on ODMP's page. And with my background, I felt that I could do something different there and help the families and the agencies. And we started that and during COVID back in 2020.
Well, great. And for folks who don't listen, who aren't as closely associated with law enforcement, I think the statistics are kind of 60, 70 officers a year killed in the line of duty, or is it maybe even a little bit higher?
Unfortunately, our numbers are higher than that now.
Where are we now?
This last year, I'd have to look up the exact number. You're in the mid hundreds.
Yep.
For example, according to ODMP, 2024 was 162.
Wow. I think I was looking for an old number, but that's 162 officers killed in the line of duty in the United States. That's a horrific number. I mean, how when you look behind, or you get behind the one of these incidents, I mean, the impact to the family and the community is significant, right? I mean, it's life changing.
Yeah, well, yeah, absolutely. And for these families, I'll tell you that the biggest fear that these families have is their fallen officer is going to be forgotten. That is by far their biggest fear. And one of the survivor spouses that I talked to really, really kind of really described it very interestingly to me, that in a perspective that I hadn't thought of before. She said that when her husband died, it was the notification by the sheriff. It was all the Lima helping. This was in Minnesota, so it was the Law Enforcement Memorial Association helping to put together a celebration of life and a celebration of service to honor that fallen officers, honor her husband's sacrifice. And the media is talking about him. Everybody's talking about him. She's got an officer parked out front. The media is talking about it online. They're talking about it, and everybody is talking about her husband and the hero that he was. And then you have the funeral, and you have the celebration of life and the celebration of service, and it's a huge, huge, huge event. And if you've never been to a line of duty death funeral, it's super emotional, with agencies from all over the country that come to honor these fallen heroes. Then you have the gravesite service. Then for 2 or 3 weeks afterwards, the survivor family still has officers checking on them every day, whether it's phone calls, texts, coming to the door, bringing over food, just making sure that they're okay. And then she said at some point that starts to slow down, and the phone stops ringing, the texts stop coming. You don't hear from anybody online, nobody at the door anymore, because it's natural for people in a tragedy like that to feel that, or to be hesitant into reaching out, because I don't know what to say to her. I don't want to make her feel bad. I don't want to make her cry. I don't want to make her think about, I don't want to put her through that. So it's
drudge up the bad emotions again.
So it's more comfortable for me to just stop contacting her, for lack of a better explanation. And it happens every time. And for her, that silence was deafening, because all she wanted people to do was talk to her about her husband. All she wanted to do was tell people about her husband. And all she wanted to make sure was that he was never and is never forgotten. And I just thought it was a very interesting explanation of the emotions that she went through in the beginning. And, describing her fear, which is the fear 99% of the families that I've worked with, and agencies, officers as well. They don't want that. They don't want their fallen officer to be forgotten. And that's part of the mission of the podcast is helping to work with these families and these agencies to get the rest of the story out, so to speak. And to
quote Paul Harvey in that context.
Great Paul Harvey, absolutely. And to make sure people know the real story. And what's interesting is a lot of these families, especially some of these older stories, they don't know all the details. Every family I've worked with has learned something from their podcast they didn't know about their fallen officer, which is interesting to me.
Well, and I mean, and the officers that I work with and interact with daily, they all, I shouldn't say not all, but most are cut from the same cloth. They're quiet. They're, they're service oriented. They're humble. They aren't wearing their emotions on their sleeves.
Right.
They pick up the shovel and get back to work. And to some degree, to your point, they probably won't talk a lot about what they've done in the field. They don't want to bring that home. They don't talk about the things, the everyday positive impacts they have in the community. And in particular, when they're lost in the line of duty, those stories, to your point, all of those memories and those stories fade away way too quickly.
Right. Absolutely. So these men and women believe in service before self.
Yep.
They're not in it for the recognition. They don't want to be, the last thing they want to be is the next news story on CNN.
Yep.
They just want to do their job. They want to help because that's their motivation. And as far as talking about stuff, unfortunately, that's how we were trained years ago. You don't talk about stuff. You don't talk about what happened. You don't talk about incidents. You don't talk about what's bothering you. You suck it up and you go to the next call. That's the way it used to be. And because of that mentality, and because of the stigma of mental health, which is why we see the incredible amount of law enforcement suicides we see in the United States now, because we're told not to.
I was chatting with another chief out of Oklahoma who focuses on mental health and bringing those issues, surfacing those issues in policing. And he said the average life expectancy of a police officer is 57 years old.
Yeah.
And a major factor, to your point, is suicides, because of years and years of trauma. He quoted me, which was amazing, and I now quote this to my friends: the number of traumas that a human being, kind of an American, will go through between until they pass away is between 7 and 8, 9 events. Loss of your parents, loss of a sibling. Car accident, something that has a fire, something that has some type of trauma to it.
Yep.
And he said that the average police officer will experience 700 traumatic events in their career.
Absolutely. And there's a study right now. A few years ago, I read this study, and they talked about law enforcement pensions, and they were talking about the typical officer on the street that retires in Minnesota. Anyway, we can retire at 55 without penalty. So and a lot of states are 20 and out without penalty. They talk about retirement officers retiring in their mid 50s, collecting an average of 17 years of retirement. And they talk about adding another 10 years to that work on the street, along with that cumulative stress and the wear and tear it has on you both physically and mentally. The average an officer retiring after working on the street their entire life at 65 years of age collects an average of 17 months of retirement.
Wow.
So it goes from 17 years at 55, add another 10 years of cumulative stress. It's incredible what that cumulative stress does to these officers, these men and women, and some process it better than others, but that really emphasizes the importance of us as leaders, as sheriffs or chiefs, in making sure that we have programs available for our officers to make sure their mental health is being taken care of, both for them and their spouses.
Where do you think we are in that transition? And to your point, the transition from the, suck it up, get back to work, to, in the kind of the old school, to, a place where each of these traumas can be dealt with, appropriately and professionally in a way that minimizes that kind of outcome at the end of their tour of duty, so to speak. Do you think we're, in the first inning, sixth inning, ninth inning? Where are we in that transition of policing?
I think it depends on where you're at, geographically. It depends on the type of agency, whether it's a large metro agency or whether it's a rural county, like the office that I'm in. I think it varies from agency to agency, and it varies from certainly from state to state. The state, whether it's the Chiefs Association in that state or the Sheriff's Association in that state, they should really be, the focus should start there, and the emphasis should start there on the need. In 2024, for example, there were 144 line of duty suicides in Minnesota. They call them blue suicides in the United States. Now compare that to 160, whatever we said, 161, 164 for line of duty. Now, one would argue, because we if you listen to the podcast, the Corey Slifko story, he was a sergeant out of South St. Paul PD who committed suicide in 2019. And once you look at the details with the majority of these, and you look at what they've been through, and you look at what their struggles are, and you look at what support or lack of support they've had, it's hard to argue that many of these suicides should be considered a line of duty death, um,
For sure.
because of the stress that they've gone under, or been under. And yeah, I don't have a good answer for you as far as where we're at. I know where we're at locally for our agency. We're light years ahead of where we were 10 years ago, but it took the loss of one of our officers to get us moving in the right direction.
Well, and as you were saying, it's kind of hard to say. It all depends. It's one of the very very interesting and challenging parts of policing in the United States. It makes it so different than other countries in the world is that you have 18,000 agencies. They're all locally controlled, effectively an outgrowth of the local militia,
Right.
all independently managed. And to your point, how they're managed really does. It's not a blue red thing.
Right.
Because I've seen, very progressive folks and for chiefs in both blue and red and big and small. I do think it's a lot of what you just described. Unfortunately, it usually takes a traumatic event inside that agency to, kind of get people to reallocate resources. I mean, if you think about it, as many people die in roughly in a suicidal construct than they are in a line of duty. You should be spending as much time training them for mental health as you train them to protect themselves in the field, which
Right.
probably does not happen.
No.
If I had to guess.
No, and it all comes down to budgets, and to put together a program like that, whether it's a peer support program or a chaplain's program or counseling that is law enforcement specific, it's an expense that it's a huge expense
Right.
for many agencies who are struggling just to pay for equipment. More or less trying to educate your county commissioners or your city councils the need for mental health support and equipment. It's a struggle. And it's got, it needs to start from the state associations and push its way down. In my opinion.
Well, and Sheriff, you are the sheriff of Dodge County, which is, I think it's south. It's in the south,
Southeast, just
east
west of
part of,
Rochester.
yeah.
Yep.
And there, I think. And how many officers do you have in your agency? In your
Sworn, we have 37, 38.
Okay. And so, and a budget of what, 20, 30, 40, $50 million. And that, I'm guessing, in that range.
Oh God, no. We're at 4.5 million.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
And so, so you said you're light years away, you're light years, beyond where you were. What have you done? I mean, what have you been able to afford to do on that kind of a small budget?
So what we did is number one, we stopped using EAP, the Employee Assistance Program, which is typically the state county association or state city association paid counseling available for staff. Because our experience, once we talked to our staff and once we polled our staff on the EAP support services, we found that 99% of our staff would never call them again. because they had no idea.
Right. It was just too
about
generic.
law enforcement. It's too generic.
Yeah.
So we went with a counseling service that's on retainer that is specifically just law enforcement.
And not to do a plug, but what's the name of the
it's I probably shouldn't mention their names, but it's out of the Twin Cities. It's out of the Minneapolis, St. Paul metro area.
Okay, great.
And her husband, she's the counselor that runs it. Her husband is also in law enforcement. So the counselors that are there are law enforcement or military, and they know what our guys are going through, guys and gals. Guys, I say that for guys and gals. But Marie Ridgway and Associates is her organization up in the cities, and she was great in helping us start our peer support program. So in our office we have peer support trained people in every department. as well as a peer support trained person who works with our retired officers. So we provide that peer support services 24/7 for not only our officers and our current staff and their spouses, but also our retired staff and their spouses. And that includes counseling services, and that includes that 24/7 availability to call or text and say, hey, I'm struggling, I need some help. We do that in addition to we now do defusings after every critical incident, which is getting everybody together who was involved in that incident, police, fire, and medical, before the end of the shift. And then we do debriefings with counselors within 2 sleep cycles. We have a chaplain program that's very active within our community. And when we reach out to all of our first responders, our peer support program and the chaplain program that we pay for through our sheriff's office budget, not only supports the sheriff's office, but it supports us, our 2 PDs, our fire departments, our ambulance service. We make sure that we are available for everyone, because it's without them being at the top of their game from a mental health standpoint. How are they going to help? How are they going to be able to do their work on the street if they're not right in their head? Frankly, if they're struggling. And it goes with spouses too. We're available for our spouses as well. And the retired guys are really important too, to make sure you support them, because you see a lot of suicides, and you see a lot of health related deaths,
Correct.
which are usually typically related to that cumulative stress.
Well, when I've talked to folks who have recently retired, basically they don't have the distraction of the job to keep them from the job itself is to some degree is a short-term antidote to having to it allows them to continue to kind of not deal with the cumulative effect. But when the music stops, you're there alone in your own silence. And you're by yourself. You don't have your band of brothers,
right?
Gals and guys.
Oddly enough, out of 70 some episodes we have on the podcast, the most downloaded podcast, all 50 states and like 60 some countries, is Corey Slifko's suicide story. Out of all of them, because that's what resonates right now with officers, because they get the stress, they get that struggle, because it's real. Yeah. As
you've described and the steps that you've taken, certainly other chiefs and sheriffs have talked about a chaplain, construct. They've talked about they've used different words, but diffusing, I think, makes perfect sense. The ability to articulate or to verbalize what you've just been through. This is the first time that I've heard, and maybe I just haven't asked, about finding a specialized counseling program, one that's designed for police. That makes such perfect sense, because to your point, it's such a small subset of the counselors that would have any ability to empathize or to sympathize and to ask the right questions and to understand what the police officer brings into that discussion. I guess to some degree, this isn't something you win. I guess it's just something that you hold back to some degree. I mean, you can't make people feel good about being put in traumatic events, right? I mean, they aren't proactively running into those things. And so to some degree, all you can do is just minimize the downsides.
Right. And the other thing we do is the annual wellness checks. So we do that's a mandatory wellness check for everybody. We call it a checkup from the neck up, and it's just making sure you're okay. And it gives you an opportunity to sit in with the counselor that knows what you're going through. If you want to talk to her or him, great. If you want to sit there for 2 hours and screw around on your phone, whatever. It's up to you how you use that 2 hours. But I want to make sure that we make that available to you once a year to make sure that you're good. If that makes sense.
Total sense. Circling back to the families, I think it's an overlooked topic of how important the family is, and how important the spouse is, either in a positive or negative context. And if they feel if they feel traumatized or under the gun, it only magnifies what the officer has to do. And I think it's great that the services that you offer are available to them.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
when you talk to the spouses on your podcasts, has I hate to even ask the question, but we've seen how society views the policing profession, and
Right,
unfortunately, that's gone south. I think it's starting to change, but it's gone
right,
south over the last 5 to 10 years.
right.
Does that only it must magnify to some degree the grief and the challenges that these families face? Because in effect, where it would have been 100% community support, it's maybe they don't feel as much of a support from the community, or maybe I'm making that up. I mean,
I think it depends on where you're at geographically. Again, you get into the metro areas. The closer you get to the tallest buildings in the state, the less law enforcement support you have, especially in Minnesota since Floyd. So we've really struggled here in our metro areas. In our rural areas, in greater Minnesota and some of the rural counties, I think that attitude towards law enforcement has made our supporters even stronger in our communities, because when there's a big law enforcement event in the state, for example, in Minnesota, we know if we don't watch it on the news or we don't hear it on the news, we know because we got people coming in with food and with baked goods and with gift certificates to restaurants, and they're buying our guys their meals at the restaurant or in the drive-through. And it's them supporting our guys when they know as a blue family we're struggling, where the law enforcement's not going to get that in Minneapolis or St. Paul or and in a lot of cases in Duluth or in Rochester. It's different. That we don't have keyboard warriors that go after us online every day in greater Minnesota. There's an inherent struggle there too from a political standpoint. In Minnesota, it's nonpartisan for sheriff. So I don't run as a Republican or a Democrat. I just run for sheriff, which I think is the way it should be. So I'm voted by whatever the chemistry is in my community. But our chiefs are appointed by their mayor and their city councils, and part of their job is to follow whatever their narrative is, their political narrative. And oftentimes in a lot of these bigger agencies, a lot of these metro agencies, politics comes into play, and it's a struggle for these chiefs. Where, for example, in Minnesota with the sheriffs, we have 87 sheriffs here, and we answer to who our voters. We don't answer. I don't answer to a county board. I don't have a boss. My boss is my neighbor.
right.
And it's a different motivation from that standpoint, and it allows us to be a lot more open and vocal about what we think is right or wrong from a law enforcement perspective. If that makes sense.
Oh no, it does. It's and I think, frankly, a lot of what we discuss on this podcast and what we see in terms of challenges in policing, it really does come along. It does seem that the tallest buildings have the tallest challenges. They
Yep,
are by far the
absolutely.
most political. They are by far the most dangerous. They are by far, in some cases, well, in most cases, they're typically underfunded. In some, or at least funding is under pressure because of all the other social services.
Right.
The amount of homelessness, the amount of mental illness, significantly increases, right? Because there's the lack
Absolutely.
of the nuclear family support in those areas. And when you talk to sheriffs, and particularly in the kind of what I would call the more urban, the more suburban and rural, at least you feel like, one, to your point, you're not under a political thumb, and two, you feel like the voters have supported you, and you answer to them, and that allows you a little bit more leeway in what you do.
Right. Right.
Well, if two more questions
Sure.
for you. The second last question is, if someone hadn't had a chance to listen to your podcast, and I will again we'll certainly direct them to go to, and this is the Officer Down Memorial Podcast. If they haven't listened to it, what would be, and if they listen to 5 or 10 of them, what would be 2 or 3 takeaways they would walk away with from just listening to those stories?
Well, one thing I want to emphasize is it's not an interview podcast. not to take away from interview podcasts,
Right.
but it's a storytelling podcast. It's a podcast that recreates the story of these officers. And I think what you'll take away is the forgotten families. These survivor families that after 2 or 3 weeks of news bites and sound bites of these officers and what happened to them, and in some cases after the court trial is done, if the shooter or perpetrator survives and ends up going through the court process, after that, these folks get forgotten. And their sacrifice is never ending. And it's a struggle for them, and it affects not only these survivor families, but it affects these agencies and these officers who are involved. It affects them for their entire career, and this gives them the ability to share the story of these officers, of these heroes, of these men and women who we've lost in the line of duty, and to give the rest of the story, so people can visualize and try and put a face to the name, and realize that the sacrifices that are made not only by these officers, but these families who support them, going out every day and night, risking their lives every day and night for us, and often for people they don't even know. I think it's certainly an eye opener. We have a ton of law enforcement listeners, but there are a ton of people that aren't law enforcement listeners. Or I'm sorry, we have a ton of law enforcement people listening, but there's also a huge audience of people who aren't law enforcement. Some that have been on the fence, trying to decide good or bad, based on what they hear on CNN or CNBC or whatever newscast they're talking or listening to. But it gives you a real glimpse of these officers and what they and their families go through. And I think that's people are going to walk away going, I didn't know these families went through that.
Well, you think about the dedication to the service, as you say. It's these the vast 99% of law police officers get involved to serve. It's not for the money. It's not for the money. It's not for the, I don't know. It's
low
not
stress
not for low stress
hours.
Correct. Exactly. It's not for
a
predictable
No.
lifestyle.
No.
They do it for the service to their communities. They give the ultimate sacrifice, their lives for the communities, and to your point, their families and the agencies that they're involved in, their fellow officers. They'll live with that, after effect for the rest of their lives. That is a compounding impact to keep us safe. And I think if anyone needed motivation to listen, by the way, you do sound a little bit like Paul Harvey. Now I'm starting to.
Well, I'll take that as a compliment.
Yeah, exactly. Now, as you tell the stories,
I love storytelling.
Yeah, no, and you do a very good job of it. But I think anyone, if you just to listen to one, it's almost, it's almost your duty to do that. If you expect to dial 911 and you expect someone to show up, you might want to actually listen to the understand the ultimate sacrifice that their fellow officers and their families make to be able to kind of answer that 911 call.
These stories they really highlight the fact that when a man or woman signs up for this line of work, signs up for this calling, that is a commitment made by the whole family, spouse, kids, parents. It's not just that man or woman that's putting on the badge and the gun belt and walking out the door. It's their whole family that's committed to this. That's committed to your community. And I think people forget that.
Well, Sheriff Rose, thank you so much. Again, this is Sheriff Rose of Dodge County, Minnesota, who does the Officer Down Memorial podcast. Where can we find that, by the way, if folks want to search that up?
It's anywhere you listen to podcasts. You'll find it from whether it's Apple or iHeart or on YouTube. You can go to the website. If you don't have a place where you go for podcasts, you can go to the website. It's officerdownmemorialpodcast.com. You can go now. The website will give you some more insight into those families, because there's pictures of the families, pictures of the officer. Often there's evidence photos and it really helps you put a visual together when you're listening to that story and trying to imagine, what that officer went through. So that's officerdonmemorialpodcast.com, the website. Otherwise, anywhere you listen to podcasts, or you can just Google Officer Don Memorial Podcast and it'll come up.
Which is what I did.
Yeah.
So it's relatively simple. Last question, Sheriff Rose. We make a small kind of honorarium in thanks to you for you taking the time to talk to us and educate the folks that listen to this podcast. Where can we make our honorarium in your name?
I'd love it if you guys did that to the Law Enforcement Memorial Foundation of Southeast Minnesota. Lawenforcementmemorial.org is their website. And that's the physical memorial that I'm on their board, and we're putting together for fallen officers in Southeast Minnesota, including Loring and 3 other fallen in our county.
It'll be our privilege to do that.
That would be great.
So, well, folks, you had a chance to listen to Sheriff Rose, who protects his community, an elected official protecting his community in Southeast Minnesota, and some of the challenges that he's faced, and when faced with the death of an officer, the changes he made to his organization to help with mental health, and that makes me feel good that agency by agency, chiefs and sheriffs starting to make and have been making the changes necessary to help their people. That's one positive takeaway. Another positive takeaway for me is I think that the changing attitude in the United States that mental health is, and just the statistic: 144 officers lost in the line of duty by suicide compared to 167 lost in battle, so to speak. I mean, if you lose as many to suicide as you do in the enforcement of law, it tells you we've got to get on top of that. So the fact that agencies are making that effort and are changing, I think that's a positive. I think the last is I'd encourage you to go to the Officer Down Memorial podcast, listen to a couple of episodes. It's not going to take the entire day. It's just a little bit of time to understand the stories behind these brave people and the families, the brave families that have that sit behind that officer. And it's a nice reminder the next time you see a police officer, to wave or to buy him offer to buy him a lunch, or to at least smile and say hello and thank you for your service, because that's what they do. This is Bob Plaschke. Again, thank you for taking the time to listen. Again, I am the CEO of PepperBall, and thank you to PepperBall for sponsoring this podcast. This is First Response, and stay tuned, or continue to check in, and hopefully bring some more compelling stories like Sheriff Rose to the table. Thanks again. We'll talk to you soon.